Oh, good afternoon, good afternoon, good afternoon. It's March 11th, 2021. This is going to be our 8th video on history, picking up from where we left off in the last video. We kind of were reflecting back on a lead up to the Civil War, the Tory Democrats, the enemies within. And right now we're going to pick up from that as going forward after the Civil War, and just briefly touch on some of the things that took place. Most of my videos in relation to history is going to be more in the evolution of the political establishment, of the enemies within, in our struggle going forward, and trying to accomplish in full the complete goal of our founders and what they envisioned America being, a nation, a free nation of free people, of all one people, of all equal, and the continued enemies within who have impeded us in being able to achieve that, of which throughout all of our history in the United States Republic has been the Democrats. Prior to the Democrats, as we know from previous videos, they were the Tory, and now they're the Tory Democrats. As we progress, now mind you too, after the Civil War, we hear from the propagated, washed out history from the Democrats that the Ku Klux Klan dissipated and faded away in the mid 1860s, and that other groups and things of such of that nature faded away. And they try to mesh themselves as being a part of the fiber of America's establishment, which is a total lie. The Democrats have always been the enemies within, and as we progress forward throughout history, we're going to see that they remain, and still are to this very day, the very same enemies within. And we're going to also touch on the basis we progress forward now, up heading into, from the Civil War forward, up into going into the 1900s. We're going to see how the Tories still play an important role, how world alliances with the Democrats play an important role, how the Ku Klux Klan plays an important role, and how they are literally a terrorist enemy within, and their actions clearly go on decade to decade, generation to generation, and now heading into century to century in our time. But right now we're going to touch briefly, like I say, most of it is on political establishment, that of the progress of America as a people, not so much about the trends or the novelty of history, but we will touch on some of the things. We did have the second industrial revolutionary boom that took place in America starting after the Civil War. Steel, the train, the steam engines, many things that were discovered and founded in the pioneering of America as it moved forward in technology. We had Andrew Carnegie, who dominated the steel industry. We know about him as well with the, I'll include links to this if you're into the trivial of the things that took place. Like I said, more or less, my videos are more focused on the political. But you had the Carnegie and Rockefeller things going on. You had Howard Hughes at the time. Things like these things that took place that were, innovative, I guess you could say. Being a free people opened up the door for free thinkers. Free thinkers became very inventive. We had electricity. We had all kinds of great innovations that took place after the Civil War that led us into the industrial boom. But that boom would slowly be hampered as well by that of the enemies within, which were the Democrats. Now, mind you, too, I just wanted to touch on, I'll include links to these things so people could read. These are the white slaves of England, and I also have right here the white slaves in the Barbary States, just so people are aware that following the Civil War in America, in the United States of America, slavery was abolished, but it still existed around the world. Not just white slaves, but as well black African slaves. The Barbary states, which were the Islamic Muslims, still continued their slave trade of both white and black slaves. And in Ireland, in Scotland, and as well as most of Great Britain, there were still twice as many white slaves enslaved in those nations as there were prior black African slaves in the United States of America. And I just wanted to point out at this point here, there's still a large movement going on, and where you have the people involved with this, like the Irish and the Scottish and the Tory and what have you. We have to understand, and I hope to tie this together so people understand, because today, when you look at the Democrats and you see the alliance that they still have with the Islamic Muslims and that of Great Britain and England and the royal families over there and what have you, and how they're fascinated with that regime of nations, these totalitarian monarchies and what have you, like Arabia is a monarchy of kings, and Iran has its royal families, and Arabia has its royal family, and England has its royal family, and Canada honors that royal family. We're going to progress forward and show, in relation to this, about some things people might not be aware of groups that existed that were fighting against these very things going on. And there was many of them who had come to America either as indentured servants or slaves of the Irish and the Scottish, and they had formed different groups in trying to have their own people freed back in what would have been Ireland, Scotland, and England at the time. And they were on board with the movement for America to end slavery, not just in the United States, but around the world. America as well kind of aided and assisted some of these groups as we move forward. You're going to see in this with the push on Canada, because a lot of the Tories went into Canada, and you still had a lot of the issues going on in Canada with Great Britain, and with slavery and attempted power over America, and working with that alliance of their long-standing allies of the Democratic Party. But I just want to point out that we still can look here and see that these are books on this. This slavery still continued. Now, after Lincoln was killed, we know we had Andrew Johnson, who is the father of rhinos. Andrew Johnson was known as King Andy. This guy pretty much was a Democrat in disguise, playing, and it was one of Lincoln's biggest mistakes was to pick this guy. Lincoln would be well, not really, I couldn't say it would be, but the Democrats' first victim of assassination. And they would do that to get Andrew Johnson put into power because he was a Democrat, and he was the guy who attempted to reverse everything that Lincoln and the Republicans did. Following him, we had Ulysses S. Grant and then Rutherford Hayes. These two Republicans were both of prior war experience, great heroes of the American history. Rutherford B. Hayes was an abolitionist, a very strong abolitionist, very much against slavery and wanting to get rid of it here. And then so was James Garfield. He was another, but now is where we get into, we're going to move forward and see. Will include links you can read up on Andrew Johnson. The Grant Reconstruction is what takes place here, where we have Ulysses S. Grant. And I wanted to touch on this with the Grant Reconstruction and the KKK. Now, as you notice here, the KKK is mentioned in this article because the KKK is still very much alive and well. And you can see here, which I'm highlighting, at the time of Ulysses S. Grant's election to the presidency, white supremacists were conducting a reign of terror throughout the South. In outright defiance of the Republican-led federal government, Southern Democrats formed organizations that violently intimidated blacks and Republicans who tried to win political power. So, I just want to state, as you can see, the Ku Klux Klan with the Democrats, and again, it associates with the Democrats. And the other thing I want to point out is that today we hear a lot from the, and as we get into the 1900s, we're going to understand where history got washed. We're not there to that point yet. It'll probably be in the next video as we break into the 1900s and we get to Woodrow Wilson. But Woodrow Wilson under the Democrats, and then under FDR going forward up into like the early 1900s into the 1930s, we see where the Democrats had literally tried to hide who they were, and they tried to rewrite American history and writing themselves into it. And then in this right here, though, we're going to go toward the progression forward to understand how this all came about and understand the terroristic threats and the way the terrorist organization of the Democratic Party and how they've been terrorizing our nation for all of our 244 years. As you know from the previous videos, we've seen how they went from the Tories, and we had the tar and the feather and the hanging and what have you. These things never stopped. And then after the Civil War, once the Democrats lost the Civil War, they still continued forming different sects and groups and organizations of terrorists to try to take down the Republic and stop the progress of the constitutional free United States moving forward. So we're going to look now, during the Reconstruction here, we see that the Democrats across South, the Klan, other terrorist groups used brutal violence to intimidate Republican voters. In Arkansas, over 2,000 murders were committed in connection with the elections. In Georgia, the number of threats and beatings was even higher. And in Louisiana, thousands of blacks were killed as the elections neared. In those 3 states, Democrats won decisive victories at the polls. Now, this is a thing, the reason I'm bringing up, because today we still have these same events going on in 2021 with the terroristic things. Right now, the Democrats they've hijacked in the last 5 decades the majority of the black communities in this nation. And they now do like they did back then with the Ku Klux Klan and other groups that they established, which we're going to go over, to terrorize people of the Republicans who were slowly, not so much in this time. At the time of when this was going on, Republicans were still very tough-skinned, strong, true Americans. As we progress forward into the Industrial Revolution, and we see the Republicans moving more into the pursuit of their happiness as business people, soft-skinned, not so much fighting people, and the Democrats capitalize on this as we progress forward, and using their terrorist and violence and what have you, and pretty much murder of people in their terrorist groups, to scare the Republicans into backing down. This is how Democrats were able to sustain themselves, because, you know, in truth, when you look, like I say, after King Andrew Johnson, and the Civil War, most of the Republican establishment then of the presidents, even like Grant, Hayes, and Garfield, believed that the Democratic Party would dissolve and melt away because people understood the terrorist organization it was, and that it was an anti-American organization that really never had anything to do with America. These were enemies within of Great Britain. They were loyal to Great Britain and out of the world's totalitarian democracies. And we had hoped, but you see, they managed to survive because they used terrorism and violence to keep their position of power, and then to keep themselves within government, they literally used terrorism and corruption in the elections to be able to take them by scaring people away from voting, or scaring people who did vote into voting for them, the Democrats. And this was a long, ongoing process. Eventually, we would see that we would have, like, Hayes we'd have Grant. Then we would have, like here, we get the James Garfield. Now, Garfield's the second assassination by the Democrats. He was a Republican. He's the second Republican to be killed by the Democrats and their terrorist reign going on. Sadly, he only, I believe, 5 months or 4 months. Garfield was shot by an assassin 4 months into his presidency and died 2 months later. He is the only sitting member of the United States House of Representatives to be elected to the presidency. So this is the second assassination of a Republican president within a short period of time. We see this happen, you know, when he was killed in 1881 here, was shot by an assassin 4 months into his presidency. It's a hard situation here to face reality, but this is what goes on. When we look here, this was the people who were blamed. A lot of people aren't familiar with the red shirts, but the red shirts were pretty much, when you do a deep study into it, you find out the red shirts were actually a blend of Tory, Ku Klux Klan, but out of uniform. They were kind of like the social, outspoken group that didn't wear the Klan, but they were associated with the Ku Klux Klan, and they were strongly associated with the Democrats. As you can see in this image here, I have the Democrat highlighted, yellow and orange here. As you can see, the association between them. Among the most prominent red shirts were the supporters of the Democratic Party candidate, Wade Hampton. During the campaigns for the South Carolina gubernatorial elections, of 1876 and 1878, the red shirts were one of several paramilitary organizations such as the White League in Louisiana, arising from the continuing efforts of white Democrats to regain political power in the South in the 1870s. These groups acted as the military arm of the Democratic Party. So we can see here up until 1878, we now have multiple groups with the Ku Klux Klan all acting as what it says right here. They were acting as militant groups of the Democratic Party. The military arm of the Democratic Party. I don't know if you see that right here. I'll highlight that right there so you can see it. I can move in on these things to make this a little bigger for people with small screens. Might not be able to see this as clear as what I'm trying to show it. And then we'll move down. Here you go. So you can read that right here. I'll leave that for a moment. You can pause the video so you can read what's being said there. There'll be links to all of this stuff within the description below of the video, so you'll be able to go and do your due diligence and research on these things, which I would advise everybody to do. Now, as we move a little bit forward here, we get to Chester Arthur, who was the man who took over after they went and assassinated the second Republican, James Garfield. And then you have Chester Arthur takes over. And then, just trying to get back to where we were. So after following him, now following him is where we also too, they have their these groups, like we say, what we see going on with the Democrats, the terrorist organization with them, with the Ku Klux Klan, the Red Shirts, and other power militant groups that the Democratic Party is like terrorist organizations. They were starting to spread because of the Industrial Revolution. They also, let's not forget, which I didn't bring up, the Knights Labor Unions. I'm going to bring that up real quick because this is another one of the terrorist groups that they had. The Knights Labor Union was one that was being done as well by the Red Shirts. And pretty much the Red Shirts were a group that acted as the Ku Klux Klan out of their Ku Klux Klan uniforms. These guys were working big time with the Knights Labor Union that was established by the Democratic Party's Ku Klux Klan. In 1869, this was when it was founded. I forgot to bring this up, so I'm bringing it up now and putting it in here. So we have this. So we have the point, like I said, we're at Grover Cleveland now. Grover Cleveland is the first Democrat to be elected since the Civil War. And he wasn't elected legitimately, as most Democrats aren't elected legitimately. They're elected through, as we see what was being said in relation to the military arm of the Democratic Party here, the terroristic groups that they use to force people to either vote Democrat or not vote at all. The Red Shirts would go around and pretty much, they knew most black Americans at this time, from even before the Civil War, all free blacks were, not all free blacks, I can't say that, because the slave-holding blacks, there was many free blacks who held slaves and were slaveholders in the southern states with the Democrats, who bred slaves and sold slaves and traded in slaves. They were free. They were Democrats. They were with the Confederacy. Oddly, right? People don't realize that there was free blacks who were actually on board with the Confederacy, because as I always say throughout history, you're going to understand it was never really a white and black issue. It turns to a white and black issue as we move forward with the Democrats. They use all kind of methods as they can to divide, of which all these things tie together within religiousry and foreign interest of those things and such like that. Like we say, we touch on the totalitarianism of like King George III all the way back to King James in ancient England, where the Bible was interpreted by the King James Version Bible, on how these people tried to use the Christian faith and religion as a totalitarianism. I wanted to include in here too a quick mention of a great movie a lot of people might want to see. I've been putting it out for people, called Monumental, by Kurt. Let me see if I can find this here. Real quick, just give me a moment. I'm going to look for something. I'll be right back. I just had to kind of go to the bathroom real quick and then do something. Pull something up. This is the movie here, The Pilgrim Formula to Save America by Kirk Cameron, and Monumental is a great movie. I would like to recommend that everybody might want to watch this movie. Very good movie about American history, our founders, Christianity in America. We're going to be doing a video after this. I got several small videos unrelated to history, but in a way very related to history that fill in some details. on request of many people wanting a breakdown of the Confederate flag and how it has nothing to do with America or Southern pride. So I'll be doing that video specifically just on the Confederate flag after this video. And then we're also going to be doing a very detailed video on the truth of the Christian founding, Judeo-Christian founding of this nation, and how strong our founders wanted our nation to be a Christian nation by the facts. So following this video, that will be what's coming. But I just wanted to put a quick shout out in here. People might want to watch the movie, The Pilgrim Formula to Save America by Kirk Cameron and Monumental. It was a really excellent movie. I really enjoyed this movie. I've been putting it out to friends on the thing, and I'll include this link to this short introduction to it. You can download or get the video for the full movie. I would recommend the full movie. Very informative information. Do your due diligence on it. It's amazing information. When we do the next short video, I'm going to be doing another video about the Christian founding of America before we go to part 9 into the 1900s here. We're going to do some fill-in movies about important videos about important history of America relating to Christianity, and also a detailed understanding of the Confederate flag to clear up some issues going on with just people who are just totally unaware and ignorant to the reality of the truth of the Democratic Party and how they are the Confederacy. And it seems a lot of people, just because of the whitewashing, I guess you could say, of history by Andrew Johnson, is what's or not Andrew Johnson, Woodrow Wilson, as we get into the 1900s, wash that history, and you have a lot of people right now just really confounded by the lies of the Democratic Party. But we're going to get back to what we're on now. So we're here with Charles Arthur, who goes in, and then we get to Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland is the first Democrat to be elected after the Civil War. And the thing that I want to touch on about with him, we also, like I say too, real quick, in mentioning back here, we had the red shirts, and I'm just trying to put things back into perspective to where they should be. We also had the Knights Labor Union. This was a thing that was dominating the industrial boom that was taking place. The Ku Klux Klan and the red shirts and what have you were all part of the Knights Labor Union that was formed by the Ku Klux Klan of the Democratic Party as a terrorist organization that would go in and terrorize that of the business owners, the large industrial manufacturing sections that were booming up in Chicago, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, Philadelphia areas, many of the, even Atlanta, Georgia, with these large factories that were mostly being developed and pioneered by that of Republicans. And what the Democrats would do is cede powers and positions within these industrial factories by the Knights Labor Union, and where they would threaten the factory owners and the billionaires and the wealthy people who were, and the bankers and what have you, and threaten them and their families using these terrorist groups they have of the red shirts, the Knights Labor Union, the Ku Klux Klan, and what have you. Democrats have always been a terrorist organization and the enemies within the United States, and they still are to this day, because many of the very organizations that they established in the progression of what time we're talking about still exist this very day in the year 2021. They try to say today that all of these things I'm speaking of in this time, yeah, they were present, but then they faded. They try to say it faded away. This is not true, because in today's time of 2021, they're still very much in support of the labor unions. They still have these organizations of the Ku Klux Klan. They still have the red shirt organizations and many other organizations. And what we see today, the battles are still going on, even without a foreign interest, of what's now we're going to progress forward into. We get through Hayes and we get to Grover Cleveland. Some of the things I want to touch on here was with the Klan right here. You had the Jim Crow laws, which were all with the Democratic Party. These were all pushed by Jim Crow, who was a Ku Klux Klan member. It says here, the Ku Klux Klan formed as a social club by a group of Confederate Army veterans in Pulaski, Tennessee in the winter of 1865 to 1860. The group adapted the name the Ku Klux Klan from the Greek word kiklos, meaning circle, and the English word clan, in the summer of 1867. The Klan became the Invincible Empire of the South at a convention in Nashville. Okay, but as we move forward, I just want to point out something too that happens during the point of where we have Grover Cleveland. Now, today in the year 2021, we have a lot of people speaking about reparations and slavery and everything's about the way that the Democrats have turned it into a racial issue of white and black divide. Well, I got news for you. One of the worst things that happened after Grover Cleveland would be right here. In the year of we'll look here, right here. You got 1884 with him. And I would like to go to this little chart right here is a lynching by year and race. So 1884, we see here that whites, 160 whites were lynched and 51 blacks were lynched. Why is that? You see, in truth, when you look and you study history, you'll find that this also too marks the era right here. The worst year for whites was 1884 when 160 whites were lynched. For blacks, the highest number of lynching occurred in 1892 when 161 were lynched. 3/4 of all whites lynchings occurred in a 14-year span from 1882 to 1895. Okay, I just want, and I'll include links to this so people can do their own due diligence. Understand that in this time where we're looking at this era going on with the Democrats, the terrorist Democrats within, people aren't aware that there was a unification between white and black Republicans. The goal of the United States was one nation of one people of all equal. It was that from the very beginning. If you watched up till now the other history series, you realize that in truth, it was never a white and black issue. If you watched in the back and you understand the founding of where the black African slave trade was started, reminiscing back to it, it was started with the Islamic Muslims in 640 AD. Even prior to that, it was the Muslims who founded the black African slave trade. Prior to 640 AD, the predominant slave within the world was white slaves. And even after the African slave trade started to take place in 640 AD with the Islamic Muslims, the majority of the world still was that of slaves were white slaves. And there was never a point or period in history that I can find in my study of world history that there wasn't always a majority of white slaves in the world over that of black slaves. Africa made up a large part of the slave trade in the continent of America as it was developing. But around the world, the majority of slaves were still white slaves. Like England, France, Britain, Germany, their slaves, they didn't want black slaves. The kings of England and Great Britain did not want black slaves. They wanted white slaves. And that's where we have the books back here, which I touched on right here. These here, the white slaves in the Barbary and also the white slaves of England. People just aren't aware that white slavery existed even after the Civil War. At the time we're at right now, white slavery ends in America. Black slavery ends in America, and but white slavery still goes on in Great Britain, England, France, and around the world with the Islamic Muslims. They're still selling white slaves after the Civil War. And matter of fact, in 2021, right now, in this year, today, they're still selling white and black African slaves. My point has always been that it's never really been about white or black. It's a humanity issue. And this is what people aren't aware of. When you look here and you see with the Jim Crow laws and the terrorist organizations of the Democratic Party throughout our history, you realize, like I say, in 1884, 160 whites were hung and lynched. And there was a reason that number was so high was because the Democrats were capturing and hanging and lynching that of white Republicans who were acting in defense of the now free black Americans, and we were a unified people of one people of all equal. Predominantly, most of that unification took place where it had since the founding of our nation in the original 13 colony territories. And now with slavery being abolished, it started to spread southward, and the lynching started to go up because white Republicans started to move south in defense of the now free blacks, trying to establish equality for them. And as the Industrial Revolution was taking place as well, many of those within the Industrial Revolution were seeking out to hire that of the now free blacks because they had really good work ethics. They were proud people who wanted to establish and make a presence known that they were proud Americans. And the majority of all of the free black Americans now were Republicans. There was a unification between white and black Republicans. And when you look back in history in that time, you really don't see much mention about white or black. Because like we say here, you see in the list here that there was no discrimination between, it was pretty much an inhumanity. The Tory Democrats believed themselves to be superiorist. They were still allied with that of foreign interest of Great Britain and many of the other totalitarian world regimes that wanted to maintain control over the United States and destroy this country. The Democrats were the enemies within. They never had an allegiance to America or the Constitutional Republic of the United States of America. They always had an allegiance and an alliance with that of foreign interests of totalitarian regimes like the Islamic Muslims in England. They were looking to position America for overthrow always. They caused the Civil War in that pursuit to overthrow America. And they continued that after the Civil War. Obviously, up to this very day right now, they're still trying to destroy America. And as we progress forward, we're going to see. Now, also here is something that most people aren't aware, and I don't know if I say this right, but it's the Finance Brotherhood. Now, this is something that exists between the Irish and the Scottish. Now, not so much of the Irish elitists of the Tory, because the Tory hated the Finance Brotherhood, because these were the people who came here as indentured servants, got their freedom in the United States, and were in pursuit of their happiness, but hadn't been able to forget that of their people they left behind, who were slaves, the white slaves of England and Scotland and Ireland. Okay, and they formed, like here it says here, was an Irish Republican organization founded in the United States in 1858 by John Mahoney, and it was procurers to Clan Nagel, I can't say whatever that is, as a sister organization to the Irish Republic Brotherhood. This is a group that as well, like as we progress forward, I'll include links to this so you can learn about this. These are actual documents of the order. You have a lot of historical records that are in our American archives in relation to these groups that were actually fighting to free the Irish and Scottish slaves, the white slaves in Ireland and Scotland after the Civil War and throughout the progression of American history as we go forward. Perception of Ku Klux and transitional violence. Okay, I have more. I'm not too, like I say, I brought these things up, I read about them. But here is another thing I want to talk about, is when we look here, this is in reference to that of history I'll give you of right here with the Ku Klux Klan. And the reason why I have these up is to show you, and this time with this here, this is during a history that's taking place, I believe, in the later 1800s, where we're hitting up around 1878, 1880s. And this is a book that's of the Ku Klux Klan, the introduction and the contents, illustrations, what have you. It's written by the Democratic members of the Democratic Party. And then I would like to just touch, like on here, there's some things I want to put here. Is in reference to what I'm talking about. The picture was Reconstruction. Okay, this is just to associate how the Democrats were furious and how they were in support of the Ku Klux Klan. Also, too, I want to put this letter here, is in reference to here. This is something that was taking place. This is during the period, so we just know where we're at as far as years. This is in 1868 going into 1870. This is an artifact letter I had found. I've been looking for a while, and I finally was able to find it. You can download this and review it. It's a Democratic National Convention. And in here is kind of like where you see that they... I'm going to come in as close as I can to this here. You can't see it. I don't want to make it... Well, you'll be able to download it and see it clearer when you have it on your own screen or viewing. I don't know how clear this... If you have a small monitor or a big monitor. If you have a big monitor, mine are 24-inch monitors. I can see it clearly on mine. I don't know how those watching this, if you're watching it on your phone or whatever, you may have to download the document and then view it yourself or view it on a big screen so you can actually read these documents. But links will be to all these things here. But this here is the prevailing spirit of the New York Convention was imparted and derived from the unrepentant Southern rebels. Indeed, its whole action was practically controlled by them, and these fiendish rebels represent the Ku Klux Klan of the South. Seymour and Blair are justly entitled to be called the Ku Klux candidates. Okay, and this is just to show that as we progress, the Democrats today, and history today, it's been whitewashed out, tries to say that after the Civil War, the Democratic Party dissipated. This is a lie. The Democratic Party continues up to this very day in the year 2021. They were founded, established, and supported by the Democratic Party throughout all of our 244-year history. And then the existence of them emerging, which took place after the Civil War, when the Democrats lost the Civil War and their Confederate slave states were defeated. But they continue on, as we see, as a terrorist organization throughout our history. We will see where, as we get into the 1900s, going into there, how they actually then reorganized to their Ku Klux Klan and their red shirts and what have you. And also, too, the thing of what I would like to mention, when we talk about the, I'm going to go back here a little bit and try to find, just looking to, right here, the red shirts, which we're going to bring up and keep them within scope so we can see them after doing the Finance Brotherhood, and we're going to continue with that as well, too, to explain where they are. But the red shirts as well, this is something that we see revived farther way ahead in history during World War I and World War II, to show you the world alliance of how the Democrats in America play a role with that of alliance of that of foreign enemies, known and well-established enemies of the United States of America. The Democrats have always been allied with foreign enemies and totalitarian regimes outside of America. They have always been the enemies within, and they still are to this day. As we progress throughout our history moving forward, we're going to realize the role that the Democrats have always played in attempting to aid and assist out of foreign nations in their overthrow of the United States or their attacks on the United States. And it still goes on to this very day. Today, in the year 2021, right now, we are in a very dangerous state with the Democrats because they have been able to mask themselves among a lot of the posterity, the youth, the young of our nation, and hide who they really are by this whitewash of history. And they've made themselves out to be the social justice warriors, it appears, in our nation now, fooling the youth who don't know the history I'm trying to reveal right now. And had the youth understood this history, like today, just for example, you have Black Lives Matter, you have these movements about slavery from 160 years ago, where the black Americans today ignorantly have no idea of the truth of these matters and don't realize that it's really not a black and white issue. This was just a divisive method and practice used by the Democrats to make it into a racial issue, to divide this nation and break up that of the unity of the white and black Republicans of during the time of what I'm talking about. What's this history all makes very clear, that was the intent of the Democrats. I bring up the Finance Brotherhood because it shows, too, for the example of that, these issues were not just an American issue, they were a world issue. And they were ongoing around the world. And the Irish Finance group of the Brotherhood here was a republic group that was interested in freeing that of the Irish and Scottish enslaved within nations outside of America, and as well to prevent these organizations of the Tories that were still operating here in America as the Democrats. And as we progress forward, you're going to see what I'm talking about in relation to that. The Red Shirts as well was another group that hated the Finance of the Irish and the Republic of the United States of America. I just have, these things are just to show here. Randolph Brother Democrats were furious because he had furnished papers, issued 5,000 copies of distribution throughout Ohio during the Seymour Grant campaign. But this shows here, I just want to show you, this is an association to the organization of the Ku Klux Klan, and how the Democrats were the organization behind, I guess, the organization behind the establishment and maintaining of the Ku Klux Klan moving forward throughout our history. We see here and here, like the candidates who are running are the Ku Klux Klan candidates, and it's mentioned in this document here about this and how it is. And I'll include links, like I said, to these things. As we move forward, we see the Klan here. This goes into 1924. It's a way jump ahead here, but these are abstracts that show for the reason of just in relation to that it's association with the Democratic Party. Again, like here is where I'm looking, and we're going to look again and go here. So we have right here Texas Choice Democrats must name Ku Klux Klan candidate or Mrs. Ferguson, wife, ousted governor, New York Times. So the Ku Klux Klan, just to show you, there's constant Democratic association. They and I'm doing this because they try to say today that the Klan faded away and after the Civil War. But I'm just putting this out. This goes up into 1924, 1923. Where the Democrats are insisting on Ku Klux Klan members being elected officials. Okay, and all the way up forward, we're ahead right now, about 35 decades ahead. We're just showing reflective of, so you can see the Klan did not fade away, and that's my main point I'm trying to make. Now, we had the Irish mobs. This is something too I would like to talk about that existed in mostly the 13 colony areas. This is where many of the indentured servants of the Irish who came in, of which many thousands of them actually never got freed out of the Southern Tories, looked at them as common slaves. It's the same as what the kings of England looked at them, or Great Britain, as just common slaves. When they would come here as indentured servants and they would go to the southern plantation areas, most of the time they never got freed. They were worked to death, no different than the Irish or the Scottish slaves in Great Britain at the time. But those who did escape would come up into the 13 colony areas and get out of there from the Southern Tories area, the Southern Tory Democrats, and they would form up these mobs up north. Some of these mobs would actually be mobs for that of the Tory. Some of them would be mobs and gangs for that of protecting of the Republic, of the Finnen, of what we're talking about prior here. As we see the making of the transitional constitutive rhetoric of revolutionary Irish nationalism, 1858 to 1876. I'll include this in here so people can get an idea of who the Finens were and what they represented and stood for, so you understand what I'm talking about. Now, in this one here, this goes into the Irish Republican Brotherhood. This is who we're speaking of, and I had in here because I want to have it where you understand, because a lot of people get confounded. Like, mind you, at this time where we're at in history, you have a unification between the white and black Republicans. At this time here where we're in history, coming into the later third quarter of the 1800s, going into the 1900s, all now free black Americans were Republicans. The white Republicans and black Republicans were unified. The onslaught by the Democratic terrorist groups were equally harsh on white Republicans as well as black Republicans. And in truth, like I say, it was not a white and black issue. It was a dominance issue of inhumanity. The Democratic Tories were inhumane people who were in alliance with that of the world totalitarian regimes who sought to keep people, slavery, what have you. They wanted to be the elitist scumbag rulers. They didn't want a free nation of free people like America, and they were doing all they could to obstruct the progress of America moving forward. Now, this point here I just want to put up so you understand when you're reading about the Finens of, you know, what we were speaking of, the Finens here in the Irish and the Scottish of these were the people who knew of the oppression still going on with the white slave trade in Great Britain. And here now being free, they were fighting for that freedom of the Republic of the United States of America. And you have to, because these things get mixed up. Some of the Democrats try to use certain groups who are not of, like the Tories. They were against the Republic of the United States. They're the Democrats. The Tories are the Democrats. But I just would like to point out, the Tories, disturbed by the increase in Republican propaganda, particularly in America, launched a propaganda campaign in the Irish press to discredit the American Finens. You see, they wanted to discredit them. So I just wanted to make sure that people understand that they were not the Tory Democrats. They were not the Tory of the Irish. Now, and what you have to understand is no different than like when we talked about in the prior video about the free blacks who owned black slaves, and they breeded slaves, and they sold and they traded in slaves. These were free blacks selling black African slaves, and themselves using them on their own plantations, is what we talked about in prior videos with you had the Ellison family. He owned large plantations. He enslaved hundreds of blacks on his plantations and labored them in slave labor. The American Indians owned slaves, black slaves, and they bred and as well traded in the black slave trade, as well as the Tory Democrats were the predominant of the black slave trade in the United States from the very founding of our nation. forward. It was, and they caused the Civil War. But you know, just trying to put out so you understand that the finesse of which will include the information for people to do their due diligence on that, so you'll understand about all these different groups like the red shirts, things that people might not have been aware of, these organizations, and as well allied organizations of the Republicans like the finesse, who were of the Irish and the afflicted of the Irish, who were in pursuit of agreeing with the constitutional republic of the United States, while the Tory Democrats were fighting against it, trying to dissolve it and break it down and do all they could to disrupt that progress. So I'm just trying to see where we're at now. We have the deadliest massacre of the Reconstruction era in Louisiana, happened 150 years ago in 1868. Where the Southern white Democrats hunted down around 200 African Americans in an effort to suppress voter turnout. So what my point is here is I'm just trying to make clear that the Ku Klux Klan, the Democrats, were predominantly the cause of all terror on the black and white Republicans who were in pursuit of establishing this nation as what the founders wanted. And that terrorist reign by them goes forward, and it doesn't end up until this very day. It still goes on. I just wanted to bring to attention this video onto the rise of the presidents as we move forward. Like I said, we had Rutherford B. Hayes. The Republicans during their establishments were the ones who led us into the revolutionary boom that was taking place in the industrial boom. With innovation and growth in America leading us into like the discovery of the steam engine, electricity, what have you. We were making great progress. We see again with James Garfield, the second assassination of a Republican president by the Democrats. We see after Chester Arthur, the push by the Democrats for Grover Cleveland, and you know, this is where we're at in this area here. We see that we had Benjamin Harris. The reason why we had Benjamin Harris, there was a big shakeup and realizing, like I said, when you see and you realize that, let's see if I can find it here. We're back on, right here, the lynching. In the year of when Grover Cleveland was elected, we see the highest level of whites being lynched, white Republicans. And like I say, this was a war ongoing between white, black, and white Democrats. It was white and black Republicans versus white, racist, elitist, scumbag Democrats, the Tory Democrats. This was really the issue in America and the world. In the world outside of America, slavery was, like I said, a majority of the slaves in the world outside of America was white slaves, and as well black slaves. And that slave trade mostly was dominated by that of the Islamic Muslims, who controlled the slave trade around the world and still do to this very day in the year 2021. The only places that still allow slavery, deal in slavery, and have slave trade going on is the Islamic states of both white and black. Is my understanding, which I'm going to be getting information on this, that there was within just the last several months of this year, there was auctionings going on for white Zaidi, I don't know if I'm saying Zaidi, out of Syria, white women sex slaves being sold by the Islamic Muslims right now in Qatar and Iraq, and as well Iran. That there is a suspect of Arabians using these white Zaidi women as sex slaves and also slaves for the tenants to taking care of that of the Arabian royal palaces and what have you. And these are what they were kidnapped out of and taken into slavery, and as well Africans as well being used, which we had in past videos we just showed recently last year, where there was black African slave auctions taking place in Qatar and as well Libya, and we know that they take place in Arabia and Iran. So I mean, these things are still ongoing right now. You have many ignorant black Americans right now complaining about slavery from 160 years ago, don't even realize that the slavery is still going on this very day. Both white and black people are being enslaved. White Christians and black African Christians are being enslaved. Our tribal people in Africa are being enslaved and sold in slave trade markets right now, still in the Islamic states. You know, but that's reality. But like I say, so we're at that point where we're taking the turn of the century, coming up onto it. I just wanted to make sure we pointed out some things about the association of the Democratic Party, its many different groups, and its association with the Democratic Party and the Ku Klux Klan, strongly associated. Some historical records that reflect these things, The fallacy of this right here is a thing with the Ku Klux Klan. Its origins, growth, and disbandments. There was no disbandment, and that's what I'm saying. I'm trying to show the fact that there was no disbandment. The Ku Klux Klan and transitional violence, how their organizations work, how they've right here, like you have the late 19th century transition terrorism in the form of violence by Irish American Finens and transitional anarchists, using secondary sources and primary archive documents found in the U.S. National Archives, the British National Archives, and the congressional records and online archives such as the Anarchy Archives and the Finance Brotherhoods, right here collections, of which I'll include so people can review these things. The main thing is understanding the difference between what was a positive and what was a negative, and also understanding on how later in history, which we're going to review as we go into those things, on how the Democrats tried to flip the party kind of thing they talk about, and how they try to say, you know, conservative Republicans this, that, and everything is the bad ones this, that, and how they use that of like the Finance Brotherhood collections and things as such to try and distract people, and they lie. They're just blatantly lies, and as we go forward we're going to expose these lies. But I thought people should know about these groups of the Finance Brotherhoods, as well as the red shirts of the Democratic Party, these other terrorist groups. These, like I say, the red shirts, when you do, you can read up on this. I was surprised Wikipedia is such left-leaning, but then again, Wikipedia is starting to get a barrage of that of true Republican historians, which is great. I've been booted off of Wikipedia by a Democrat who didn't like that I was disputing that there ever existed a Republican Democratic Party, which I'm trying to tell you right now, there never existed a Republican Democratic Party during a time when this idiot Democrat tries to say that it was. It's a lie. It's a propagated lie. There was no Democratic Republican Party back in the time of the late 1700s or early 1800s. It never existed, to be honest with you. It's a propagated lie that the Democrats use in an attempt, like, just to give you an example right here. We're going to go back and we're going to look here. I'll show you right now. I'm going to give you an example. This is right here, Wikipedia lies, and what Wikipedia allows them to get away with. When you look here, and you see here, George Washington, unaffiliated. That's a lie. He was a Republican. And I'll prove that as we go forward. We're going to touch on base of the true founding and the Christian founding on these things, and we're going to touch on George Washington and his Republic principles. George Washington was opposed to political parties, but Republicanism was the foundation of what George Washington founded this country upon, and there's no denying that. John Adams was a Republican, not a Federalist. And then here you see with Thomas Jefferson, Democratic Republican, they try to claim this. He was a Democratic Republican Party. Well, during this time here with Thomas Jefferson, there was no Democratic Party. The Democratic Party was not founded until 1828. The Republican Party was founded by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison right below him in 1792. The Republican Party was founded by James Madison and Thomas Jefferson in 1792. This is a fact, undisputable fact. We covered that while we were covering these years in our prior history videos. So go back and watch those videos if you want a more in-depth understanding of the Republican founding of the Republican Party in 1792. But it was right after the Bill of Rights was done that the Republican Party was founded. And in brief, again, as I say back in the other videos, it was based off of the principles of that Article 4, Section 4 of the United States Constitution, which guarantees to every state in the Union a Republican form of government. Thomas Jefferson and James Madison formed that party in representation of Article 4, Section 4 of the Republican form of government that's guaranteed to every American. So, and though George Washington did not agree with it, and obviously later in life we would find Thomas Jefferson, in my study of history, of American history, I find when he was younger, was an arrogant man, great, smart, very smart man, but he was ignorant in the sense that he had knowledge but no wisdom. But we do see him mature as time goes on, and as well James Madison, and we do see in letters in reference to the archives of what's things we're going to touch on in the future of actual archive records. I have a request in for certain things that I want to find that they haven't uploaded yet, which reflect the conversations between James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington in depth about the Republican Party. As I say to everybody, though, if you want to understand that America is not a democracy and we are not a democratic state. This is lies, again, and propaganda of the Democratic Party. We are a republic, and Federalist Letter number 10 by James Madison pretty much makes clear, even Hamilton makes clear that America is not a democratic democracy or a democracy in any way, but is a republic, and they define pretty clearly the difference between a democracy and a republic. So people need to understand that we are not a democracy in the United States of America, we are a republic. And there is a big difference between a democracy and a republic, and we can't make the mistake of assuming that America is a democracy. That would be a grave mistake that we'd make, and it would undo everything our founders intended for us to be. But with that said, this is where we are. And I just wanted to show you, Democratic, Republican, you see James Madison. They also have James Monroe. Here you have John Quincy Adams. Now here is where you have Andrew Jackson, who is in 1828 when the Democratic Party is actually established. And then they call him a Democrat. And then we see Democrat. Whig the Whig Association did not exist on this. Then you have Democrats. You see, they just do everything they can to hide that the Republicans were the founding. Because I'll tell you right now, all these, where you see this Democratic Republican, they were Republican. Thomas Jefferson was a Republican. James Madison was a Republican. James Monroe was a Republican. And John Quincy Adams was a Republican, because here you have the National Republican, they go on par. But there was no such thing as a Democratic Republican Party. This is a fake lie made up by a Wikipedia Democrat who is trying to inject into our history that there existed this fake fallacy of a party. It's just a lie. It didn't exist. There was no Democratic Republican Party during the founding times of our nation. Nothing of a Democrat was ever mentioned outside of it being in a negative way of not wanting association with in the United States of America. We never wanted nothing to do with a democracy or a democratic state establishment in America. We knew that they were the cause of the majority of the rise and falls of all the world's totalitarian regimes, of which America wanted nothing to do with whatsoever. So I just want to point out that this Democratic right here, this Democratic Republican Party, better known as under various other names, which in truth that it might have been known under other names, but it was never a Democratic Republican Party. It never existed. There is nowhere in federal history archive records of any history at all in our founding time that you will find a mention of a Democratic Republican Party. It just did not exist. And I've showed this in other videos too, to show that when you see in the time with James Madison, Thomas Jefferson's elections when they ran for president, they ran as Republicans. It's on their posters. It's in the federal archives. It's a fact they were Republicans. There was no such thing as the Democratic Republican Party. But I just want to lead off with that here, and I guess that's where we're at. We're going to be going into... I have no idea where that's coming from, people.
The Charger has outdone the others for decades and continues to impress with exceptional performance.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, just shut that up. But we're going to, like I say, I'm going to put links to this. This video is more or less to make aware as we go through the later 1800s, getting ready to go into the 1900s, some of the things that I just want to make people aware of in relation to the Finance Brotherhood collections. As well, because these are important things. The red shirts are what most people, I was surprised to find that Wikipedia even has a thing on this. But like I said, when I looked into this, this was a conservative that made this site. So he is pointing out, and that's what we need. That's what the purpose of this is, and that's what we need. I'm going to close off with this here. We'll put links to this so people can look into it. And like I said, go forward with it. The Finance Brotherhood, the red shirts, what have you. The issue about the lynching and of white and black Republicans, so you understand that in truth, we were trying, the Republican establishment of the United States of America was looking to establish what it accomplished after the Civil War, a nation of one people of all equal, the Americans, under a republic. Okay, the Democrats were the Tory Democrats who were opposed to this nation even being, since the War of Independence, the Tory Democrats were opposed to the American Republic Patriots. They didn't want to see this nation succeed. They still don't to this day. As we progress forward, we're going to understand, but the point where we're at right now is after the Civil War going up into the 1900s, to understand how the Democrats have always been a terrorist organization of the enemies within this nation. And they've always been doing all they can to hamper the progress of America moving forward in its goal of establishing a true unified nation of one people of all equal under the Constitution of our great Republic of the United States of America. My goal in this, as well, is to show that white Americans of the Republican establishment, as well as black Republicans, were equally targeted by the Democratic terrorist organization of the Democrats, okay, with their Ku Klux Klan, their red shirts, and many other organizations that they had, like the Knights Labor Union and what have you. They targeted both white and black Republicans equally. Both were equally afflicted by that of the terrorist organizations of the Democratic Party, and were, as we can see in the records as they show, were equally murdered, hunted down, and killed by the Democratic terrorist organizations. We do see this breakaway in the start of the 1900s. We see that the fall away of the whites not being so much targeted as the blacks, but the blacks continue to be targeted by the Democratic Party. As we break into the 1900s, you're going to understand the revival of the Democrats and how they wage an onslaught war, and how this onslaught war leads to them dominating, taking over control of the minority black communities within this nation, of which they, by the 1950s and 60s, they were able to accomplish, and they still maintain that control today. But that's where we're going to leave off with. I just wanted to give people a brief on the history of some of the things they might not have been aware of. And also, like I say, too, to those that are with the Black Lives Matter and this reparations and all that, you may want to look into the lynchings, the Jim Crow laws, the Democratic Party, understand as well, look into the facts of the issues with free blacks who own black slaves. And honesty, in all honesty, right before the Civil War broke out, that ended slavery in America, in all honesty and truth, by percentage of population, by 1850s, going into this era of the Civil War, in all honesty, the free blacks in this country own more black slaves than whites owned black slaves. That's just reality. I know it's a reality many don't want to face, but it's a truth. It was never really a black and white issue. It was a humanity issue. And the issue in America, the United States of America, the issue resides with that of the Democratic establishment of the Tory Democrats. And that's the same Democratic Party that exists to this very day. And in the year 2021, the majority of all issues the United States Republic of the United States of America are facing due to the manufacturing of those issues by that of the very same Tory Democrats who are still running the Democratic Party in this very day, and is still allied with the very same allies they've always been allied with, the Islamic Muslims and that of the foreign totalitarian democratic democracies around the world, of socialist states and what have you. As we progress forward, we're going to see very clearly that the main issue of this great republic of the United States of America is the same issue that has been for 244 years, the enemies within of the Democratic Party. If we were to get rid of the Democratic Party and those of the evil intent of that party, those people of that evil, long-standing now for 244 years, organization of the Democratic Party, if we were to get rid of them, we would have no issues in America. We would be what our founding fathers wanted us to be. But getting there is going to be facing the reality of this truth in history, and that's my goal, is to make this truth in history known so people can see it, and as we progress forward, understand up to this very day in 2021, this group of what we are pointing out as the enemies within of the Democratic Tory Party is still existing as it was then, and it still is today. The same party and its same allies play a role in today of keeping America at a divisive nature of what we face today in our time of 2021. But with that said, I'm going to lead off, and we're going to end this here. I'll include links, like I said. I hope you enjoyed the video. Again, it was not so much of a progression, but as a review of things that I felt were important, like the red shirts, the Finance organization of the Irish, Republic, and their fight and plight with dealing with white slavery still going on in the world even after the Civil War, and doing their part in trying to bring recognition to that in foreign countries, which eventually they did, and it ended the white slave trade that was taking place in Great Britain. Incomplete, but it still never was ended, was stopped, was the Islamic State slave trade that still goes on to this very day in the year right now. As a matter of fact, today it's still going on. Like I said, I've got reports and things I'll probably include in future videos about the slave trade taking place right now in Arabia and Iran and Tehran, and is still in as well going on over in Lebanon right now. It's still going. They're selling. There's supposedly still going on with the slave trade right now. The Yazidi women who were kidnapped out of Syria and Iraq and are still, there's massive women that are white women being sold in the sex slave trade industry going on in the Islamic States. But with that said, I'm just going to leave off with that. And the next one we're going to be picking on is breaking off from that of which we might just go to back real quick. We'll probably break off into that of breaking into the second term of Grover Cleveland, going into heading up now where we get through Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and we start to break into the early 1900s with Woodrow Wilson. So that's where we're going to be going. And when we get into the early 1900s now, is where we really get to see the inhumanity of the Tory Democrats, who are still the very same Tory Democrats running the Democratic Party today and dividing this nation today with the very same issues that they've always been doing in this nation. It's just disgraceful that no one's aware of the truth of these things. But this is where we're going to be picking up on, and then we're going to be touching on the historical events that take place in the early 1900s heading up into 1934. We'll probably be doing from the 1900s up to about 1934 where we get to FDR. With that said, like I said, I'm trying to keep the videos a little bit shorter so I can keep the attention span of people. But understand there's no such thing as a short video when it comes to these things. There's so much stuff that has to be covered, and there's so much importance with it at all. We're trying to cover a span of 244 years, and in that 244 years, the fight for the Republic of the United States of America and its goal of reaching and accomplishing that of one people of all equal of the American people. The only obstructing thing of what I'm trying to say throughout these videos, or what we'll see by the end of these videos, concluded even in this very day, the only thing obstructing us from reaching the true goal of America is the Democrats. And we're going to see as we progress forward, they are a terrorist organization within that has been the creator, manufacturer of all the issues that we're facing today in the year 2021. And as we progress throughout history, we're going to see how they continue to be doing those things and how those things today are still the very things dividing this nation and causing the issues that we face today. It's just disgraceful. But with that said, everybody, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, you can comment below. If you didn't like it, you can comment below. I'll include links to everything that we reviewed up here on these web pages, so you can do all your own due diligence and take the time to learn your history and learn who you are and what your place as an American is. Thank you all for taking the time to watch my video, and I'll see you on the next video. Have a great day.